Okay, just something fun to start off. What I think is the most boring parts of the class, and it's a good thing it's recorded because you can pause or advance, take a break as you like. And this is a discussion of the readings. And what are some of the more important parts of the readings I assigned you? Okay, so the first reading that I assigned you is an article looking at what the plague of Athens, what theory, in other words, what kind of political philosophy emerged as a result of the plague hitting Athens, considered the birthplace of democracy. And one of the first great, what I want to look at in this lecture is how the plague affected, one of the first great historians, and also somebody we would consider a theorist of international relations, and that's Thucydides. Now, what is Thucydides saying in his observations? So in his history of Greece, of course, he's talking about international relations, the history of relations between the city-states of Athens and Sparta. But look what he is saying in sentence number 1 in terms of the effect of this disease on the internal order of Athens. In other words, this is the question we want to ask, kind of from a philosophical perspective. How does a disease affect power? Or in this case, what is sentence number 1 making us realize is how does a disease lead to the dissolution of power? How does a disease affect law and order? And what kind of chaos does that result in? In Thucydides' observation, the restraining impact of the state collapses when the disease hits. In other words, people no longer feel the power of the state. Look what he says here. Men who concealed what they took pleasure in now grew bolder. Think what happens sometimes during a national crisis, such as a disease, looting emerges, people go on the street to protest lockdown measures. In other words, it creates chaos and anarchy. In other words, who is Thucydides in this case, and what makes him a theorist? Well, he's a precursor to the Florentine theorist Machiavelli, as well as the British theorist Hobbes. In other words, what would both Thucydides, Machiavelli, and Hobbes agree on? That people feel the power of the state. And when something emerges where the power of the state is no longer felt, chaos emerges. What is the effect of the plague on Athenian democracy? It would lead to its collapse. And of course, one major question that's being debated as a result of COVID-19 is what will the effect of COVID-19 have on democracies? A good number argue that COVID-19 is going to lead to the erosion of a citizen's privacy and liberty. In other words, weakening democracy in several states. In the kind of first proto-democracy, the direct democracy of Athens, this is one of the results. Now, Athens post-plague, what is Katherine Kelaidis telling us in number 3? Was the same quasi-democracy, or kind of went in an authoritarian direction, to the point where the philosopher Socrates was executed by being ordered to take hemlock. Now, look at sentence number 4. It's this post-plague Athens in which Plato writes the Republic. Now, the public, both Socrates and Plato are skeptical of democracies. They're skeptical, particularly of the Athenian democracy that gave power to the masses. In other words, let's look at the connection. We have the plague, the execution of Socrates, Plato's teacher, and then Plato writing a book saying democracy is not the ideal regime type, because giving power to the masses is not a wise decision. What is the argument of the Republic is this, that the perfect city-state should be ruled by a class of philosopher kings, who he calls the guardians, because only they are wise enough to administer the state. Now, what does Kelaidis say then in the following part of sentence number 4? The Republic became the template for totalitarianism, because Plato's vision in the Republic is not really a republic as we know it. It would be where the philosopher kings have almost a direct authoritarian hold on society. And then what finally spelled the end of democracy in Athens? It was the conquest of Macedonian King Alexander, otherwise known as Alexander the Great, the pupil of Plato's student, Aristotle. Okay, what the Great Plague of Athens can teach us now, basically in a nutshell, is diseases are a threat to democracy. And we're seeing that, history is the study of continuity and change, but it doesn't mean necessarily history is always repeating itself. But nevertheless, because Athens was a different type of democracy than the democracies we have. Athens was a direct democracy. Okay, there is no direct democracy in the world today. Yeah, some people make the argument about Switzerland, but let's just put that aside. So that's the lesson. From a philosophical perspective, the virus has the power to erode democracy. Then we get into a discussion of Machiavelli. What did Machiavelli know about pandemics? Okay, so sentence number 1, what is it saying? The bubonic plague, which is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, was endemic to Renaissance Italy. What does the word endemic mean? What's the difference between an endemic and pandemic? It's this. A pandemic emerges first. Actually, let me give you 3 definitions. An epidemic is when a pathogen emerges in a particular geographical area, a particular city, and rages out of control. It's beyond the control of the authorities to contain it. So for COVID-19, the epidemic began in Wuhan, in the city in China. In other words, we're not sure the exact origin of where COVID-19 came from, but we knew it spread out of control in Wuhan. And once it took root in Wuhan, it would spread around the world through air travel, becoming a pandemic. At this point, we're probably at a stage where COVID-19 is endemic. What does that mean? Once it's spread around the world, if the disease stays and it's with us, it's endemic. We might get vaccinated, but the virus is still circulating in the human population. That's what it means to be endemic. So in 1348, the plague came to Renaissance Italy. You had a pandemic, in other words, it spread from Central Asia to Italy. That means it's spreading around the world. And when it says endemic, that means the plague would stay. And basically it hits in 1348, but then it would reemerge in various waves over centuries. So that when Machiavelli, of course, living much later, would have witnessed the bubonic plague. So who was Machiavelli? Well, he was a diplomat, he was a philosopher of power, and a government advisor. Now imagine this. We're living just through a single epidemic wave of COVID-19. It hasn't invaded. Imagine in your lifetime living through 5 waves of COVID-19. Well, that's what Machiavelli was. How did the government of Florence, in other words, the government in which Machiavelli worked for, how did they handle it? Well, let's look for the continuity and change here. What similarities do we see? In Florence, they set up plague hospitals. just like we did in the present. In Florence, they set up quarantine, just like we did. We just call them lockdowns. The city gates were closed. In our cases, we closed borders by imposing travel bans. And there was an economic downturn. And what did the Florentine government issue? What today we call stimulus checks. So in other words, during Machiavelli's lifetime, he would have also witnessed the power of the plague to affect power itself. In other words, when we read his seminal, so Plato is famous for the Republic, Machiavelli is famous for his tract, The Prince. In other words, The Prince is not just about exercising power, but what we tend to forget is about exercising power during a pandemic. And remember what Machiavelli said, the ideal prince is one that's loved and feared, but if you can't be both, it's safer to be feared. Now, in this case, the prince's fear is not from the prince himself, but from his soldiers. And what is Machiavelli suggesting? Soldiers need to instill fear in the civilian population so they obey the lockdown. So far in this class, we talked about two roles of the security sector. The army controls the borders. Now we're getting to the second role, is to enforce lockdown. And to enforce lockdowns can only be happened if people fear the soldiers. Take the case in the US. The police nor the soldiers are tasked when enforcing a lockdown. In other words, there is no fear. In countries like Italy and Spain, the military, the security sector was deployed to enforce the lockdown. And in Italy and Spain, in the modern day, they were feared because they had the power to give you a massive fine or put you even in jail. What was the problem in Florence? That there was not enough fear. So think where Machiavelli gets his theory that the prince needs to be feared. And that's a problem. They weren't scared enough to stay at home. They were too selfish for the common good or collective health security. So what do you have to do? You have to create a death penalty in these states so people obey the lockdown order. And what do you do? So you impose a total lockdown, you give harsh penalties, and you carefully control information. Propaganda is not just about information that's released that's misleading. Propaganda is also the withholding of information. I think in COVID-19, how many governments didn't want to sound the alarm and cause panic? They were controlling the information. They were not releasing information about the severity of the disease. That is information control. Okay, now this article is going to read, it's quite profound. It's written by Harari, the author of Sapiens, Homo Deus, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. And it's quite profound because it deals with the transition to modernity. So we're going to break it down sentence by sentence. What does he say in sentence 1? The coronavirus has hit globalization. Now remember, in the terms of modern processes, in other words, that's the process that's connected to the ideology of globalism. Okay. What was the knee-jerk reaction today with the emergence of COVID-19? Deglobalize the world. Build walls, restrict travel, reduce trade, or in other words, restrict traveling over mass distance, reduce trade or reduce mass production and mass consumption, build walls and give in to the nationalists who say the masses of our country have to be protected from the masses of other countries. Now in sentence number 2, Harari advocates not this kind of segregation, but cooperation. What is modern about this? Well, he is invoking a modern school of international relations that's called liberalism. International relations consists of 2 competing schools. You have realism, which basically is about, realism basically argues that it's the It's in the inherent nature of nations to compete and conflict with another. That characterizes the way politics has worked since time immemorial. Thucydides could be considered one of the fathers of realism. Machiavelli is also a realist. So is Hobbes. They're both arguing it's in the inherent nature of people to fight. And there has to be some kind of power, a leviathan in Hobbes' word. In other words, the state to restrain people's selfish instincts. Liberalism, on the other hand, argues that both people and nations, there are mechanisms to induce them to cooperate, collaborate, and cooperate. So notice, what is realism? It's about 2 C's, competition and conflict. Liberalism, about 3 C's, cooperation, collaboration, cooperation, collaboration, what's the other C? Collaboration. Okay, let's just say 2 C's, make it easier, cooperation and collaboration. So, in this case, when the epidemic killed millions of people before the current age of globalization, what is he reminding us? That the ability to travel or conquer mass distances existed beforehand. There were no airplanes and cruise ships. Yet the Black Death was still able to spread over mass distance. In other words, by saying this, globalization in and of itself can be blamed for the spread of a disease. All that globalization does is makes the disease spread much faster. But still, even in the pre-modern era, diseases could spread over mass distances. In 1520, this guy named Francisco landed with Cortez on the in Central America, in Mexico. But still, smallpox could go on and infect people in Mexico and then go on to kill 90% of the Mexican and Southern American population, eventually spreading to North America. That was a mass amount of killing. Now, this is the pre-modern coexisting with the modern. Okay, there were no trains, buses, or donkeys even back then, right? In other words, no mass transportation that spread the disease, but Harari forgot to acknowledge. Francisco traveled over a mass distance to get from Spain to Mexico. So there's the modern, but then once it hit Mexico, it spread via pre-modern means. People walked long distances and carried smallpox with them, killing 90% of the population because they had no immunities. Until the modern era, or the era of mass science, humans blame diseases on gods, demons, and superstition. Those are pre-modern beliefs. When you believe in angels and fairies, not science. In other words, bacteria, viruses, contaminated water, all of that is science. Now, in 1967, look how deadly smallpox was. What won? The World Health Organization. What is the World Health Organization but a body of cooperation, collaboration, eliminating this scourge? So what does history teach us? Well, number one, closing borders is not the solution. Because even before the age of globalization, where it was easy to close the gates of a city, the disease was still spread. Small bacteria can spread via rats. Rats aren't stopped by city walls. Now, number three is an argument for liberalism. Share mass information or scientific information, global solidarity, the masses cooperating with each other. Number four is reiterating the need for international cooperation. And number five is this. We have to rethink the way we interact with the environment. That's what number five is. The border between the human world and the virus sphere is porous. And we have to think, how do we stop being exposed to what he calls the virus sphere? And now what is he also calling for? To invest in modern healthcare. They are, instead of locking borders, More finances should go into helping nurses, doctors have their personal protective equipment, because they are the real border between the humans and the virus in this case. Number one, what is it saying? Diseases know no boundaries. Now, what is it saying? This is kind of, number two is a swipe of the Trump administration, which withdrew aid to the WHO. Because the Trump administration operated in realist terms. Now look at sentence number 3, when he's talking about the European Union to cooperate, that is a call for liberalism. And then finally, he concludes with global cooperation, another call for liberalism. Okay, that ends the reading. So just watch this on your own time. And that's it for this week's lecture.